Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Perpetual Chess. We are joined by another author this week that I am excited to speak with. I've long been a fan of his work, and it's a great new one, as we will be discussing. But first, as always, wanted to thank our sponsors, Chessable.com. Grandmaster Ben Feingold's delayed and anticipated new course is coming soon. Kasparov is coming soon, for those of you who follow them on social media may have seen. And of course, recent guest Grandmaster Axel Smith's much anticipated Woodpecker 2 also should be coming. So this is a long way of saying just keep an eye constantly on what they have coming out, because there is so much good stuff. And if you sign up for Chessable Pro, be sure to use the link in the description. As for this week's episode, our guest is a FIDE master and two-time Massachusetts state champion. He's also an award-winning author of 7 chess books, including the classic Intermediate to Advanced Tactics Manual, Forcing Chess Moves, which I, of course, often recommend here on the pod, and the excellent brand new book, The Real Paul Morphy, which we will be discussing in detail. I finished it yesterday. It's outstanding. It gave me new respect for the height of Morphy's genius, but also, unfortunately, for the degree of mental illness he suffered in his later years before he died at the young age of 47. Our guest, Charles Hertan, was a practicing mental health professional with a master's in social work. So he's the perfect person to illuminate both Morphy's chess genius and also to elucidate his unfortunate mental decline. Obviously, I knew a fair amount about Morphy going into this book, but I was really moved by it and highly recommend it. And I'm excited to welcome to the program Charles Hertan. Welcome, Charles.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this book, Charles. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So
I
I just,
enjoyed making it.
yeah. And how long did it take you to write this book?
So it was a 4-year project that started during COVID, which presented a problem because I like to write in cafes, and there were no open cafes when I started.
Right.
Very thrilled when one local cafe finally opened, and I did a lot of writing there. And yeah, I just got further and further into it, and uh, my philosophy is to keep going until the book feels done. And so, yeah, it took 4 years. Somewhere along the line, I made a deal with my publisher, New in Chess, and once we iron that out, then I'm under a deadline. So then the work goes faster. I had to put in a lot of 8-hour days near the end.
Yeah, I'm pretty useless without a deadline as well. But yeah, and being that it's a new in chess book, of course, it's available on the new in chess reader is will be making its way to the United States in physical form as well. We
It
should
is
say,
it is available on Amazon now in the
oh,
United.
great, already available on Amazon. And this actually, Charles, won't be out for a couple weeks from when we're recording this. And we should say, I always like to tell listeners just kind of what sort of format they're signing up for. Of course, New in Chess always provides free previews of the books, which I'll link to. But also, one of the unique selling features or appealing features of this book is that the chess and the prose are intertwined. So it is a great fit for reader formats like the New in Chess Reader or Forward Chess. But it's also, I'm sure, a lovely book to sit down with a chess set with as well. And do you know if it will be on Kindle?
It is on Kindle. It is for sale on Kindle on Amazon.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
already.
And we'll return to the formats and stuff, but let's dig right into Paul Morphy, Charles. I mean, such a fascinating figure. Um, so you wrote in the epilogue to the book that Morphy went from unrated to unbeatable in a 2-year span. A rise to world class that's possibly unmatched in human history, not just talking about chess, but even domains outside of chess. So what is it that made Paul so special, that made such a rise possible?
Uh-huh. Well, he was one of the great talents in chess history, if not the most talented. And when masters and experts describe it, he was just a universal player who was incredible in every respect. He was kind of like born to play. First there's his memory, which was incredible. A world-beating memory, and he had two kinds of memory. He could remember everything that he read, which is a phenomenal asset for a chess player. but then he also had a photographic memory, which, it's the key skill to being a great blindfold player. And he was one of the great blindfold players of all time. For instance, if you compare him to the average master like me, I can remember variations very well. When I was a kid, I thought I had a poor memory, but that's because I was around friends like Joel Benjamin and Michael Rode.
Right.
Um, uh, as in adulthood, I realized actually my memory is very good and I could remember variations. But one thing I could not do, I don't have a photographic memory. When you have that, it's literally like there's a chessboard in your brain, and when you go through the moves, you're moving the pieces on the board, and you can see it as well as if you're looking at a real board. And that confers an incredible advantage. And he had that kind of photographic memory where, once he looked at a game, it was imprinted in his head for life. I can't even say that about my own games. I've been looking back on some of my early games, and a lot of them were completely gone from, I can't
Yeah.
remember anything. It's like looking at someone else's game. But, so he had that phenomenal memory. He had a phenomenal positional judgment, which was way ahead of his time. And his contemporaries spoke to that a lot. Today you usually hear about his brilliant side, and people have forgotten that. But his contemporaries said that he had the capacity to assess every aspect of a position intuitively. Um, he also had a revolutionary chess philosophy, which was, very strongly focused on accuracy. It seems obvious today, but he was the first player who really made that the centerpiece of his game. Um, so that gave him a big advantage. And then also he was a great researcher. He studied chess very seriously and deeply. And on top of all that, he was a fantastic practical player. He was very cool under pressure. He never seemed to get rattled. And even with his back against the wall, he could produce his best chess. So he was really a universal player with, no real weakness to attack, and he was the first player like that in chess history.
Yeah, as you write in the book, I think it often, because we've all seen like the opera game and some of his famous sort of swashbuckling attacking games, he gets sometimes mischaracterized by um, less studious players as sort of this ruthless attacker. But as you write, he was more in the vein of like a Fischer or a Kasparov who attacked quite skillfully when the position demanded, but did not try to force things.
Yeah, or tried to force things soundly. If he did,
Right.
as Robin Fischer, they both were very sharp players, but they stayed within the bounds of soundness, and that was Morphy's game evolved that way. He started out as a little bit more of a swashbuckling gambitier, but that was because in the United States nobody could withstand his attacks. So he didn't have to evolve until he went to Europe, and he started realizing that I mean, players like Lowenthal, or who were well prepared theoretically, they could they could mask the risks that he was taking in his gambits. So he immediately starts to pivot, because he knows everything that's going on theoretically in the chess world. He just pivots to sounder variations, and then he has fantastic success with that, and starts to realize he doesn't have to play gambits to be successful. He can, and like I said, he values accuracy above all else. So he starts to realize that sounder play is really uh, more in line with his chess philosophy, and that he's even more effective if he, tempers some of the risks that he took earlier in his career.
Yeah, and obviously it was quite effective for him. So, Charles, we have a few, actually, several listener questions that I'll be mixing in as well. And the first one is from Roy Lopes. Roy, thanks for helping to support Perpetual Chess. And he says, "Congratulations on the publication of your book on Morphy. I'm looking forward to reading it." And he also asked about Morphy's talent, which we just discussed, but he also wondered if there was any evidence about his training regimen, which obviously, there was no Chessable, there were no engines then. It was a lot different.
Right. Yes, that's right. He did it the old-fashioned way, but he did it really well. So what we know about his training regimen is he had a very strong teacher. His uncle Ernest Morphy may have been the leading theoretician in the United States. At the time when he started taking Paul under his wing and teaching him openings. And all the evidence indicates that his uncle was subscribing to the leading European journals, so they were studying current theory, and so his uncle also says that Paul never read a book until maybe he was in his teens, but he was doing this deep study of opening variations with his strong uncle, who was a master player and a great analyst. And then as he gets a little bit older, um, in his college years, his friend Charles Morian, um, tells us that Morphy only had three books, and I put only in quotes because the three books were the tournament book of the London International Tournament 1851, which was the first great international, and there were like side matches. There, it was a chess extravaganza, and that whole book is, gives all the games from that event and the side events, and it's all annotated by Howard Staunton, who was the world's leading chess author and theorist at the time, and was, an ex-world champion at that time, but one of the strongest players in the world. So he had that book. He had Chess Studies by Kling and Horwitz, which is probably the first truly great opening book in chess history. And then he had a volume by Kieseritzky um, uh, of Kieseritzky's chess columns, which would have all the games by the leading European players. So even though he had few books, he had the best books, and from all we can tell, he devoured them. He read them, for total comprehension. Like we know that not only did he read Chess Studies by Kling and Horwitz, but he pronounced it a good book, though not free from mistakes. So when he went through these endgame studies, he apparently analyzed everything so that he fully understood it. So he was a very deep researcher, and when you combine that with his memory, he would analyze these books, basically understand them completely, and then they would be committed to memory forever. So that was a big part of his training regimen as well. A very deep study of all the current important materials that were available.
Yeah, and as you alluded to previously, of course, the photographic memory doesn't hurt when it comes to that.
Yeah.
One thing that surprised me from reading this book, Charles, is the time that he didn't do much chess, because as you alluded to, his rise was so swift. But there was a period, of course, he famously grew up in New Orleans. As you mentioned, his uncle was a strong chess player. His dad, who was a well-respected judge and lawyer in the community, also enjoyed chess. But then at some point, he went away to school. I couldn't tell if it was like would be considered college or sort of a boarding school,
It
but
was, yeah, more like a boarding school, which sort of morphed into college. And
okay.
there were schools like that back then where
But he did
you,
very little chess while he was away.
that's right. Yeah, yeah. yeah, his friend Morian said that he didn't even own a chessboard. Morphy didn't even own a chessboard when he first went there. And yeah, he didn't have much opportunity. And I think he wanted a break from chess. He wanted to sort of have a normal adolescence and get into things that his peers were doing. And he was so far above everyone at his college that his boarding
Right.
school that there was no one to play with. We do find that when he went home for 6 week break, school intersession, he would play then at the club. And also, he must have been studying the books he had while he was at college, although he didn't talk about it, because then we see this phenomenal growth in his theoretical knowledge between when he was a child prodigy and when he reappears at the American Chess Congress at age 19.
Yeah, and just to give listeners context, so we're talking about he's age 16, 17 at the school where he's not even really pursuing chess. And by the time he's 21, as you write about when he goes to Europe, there's no world championship formal title yet, but he is considered clearly the best player in the world just 4 years later.
Right.
Even though
Yeah.
Staunton would pretend like he wasn't, and but while dodging playing him.
Right.
Um,
Yes, but but nobody else really
right.
does it. Yeah.
And returning to the topic of his genius, I mean, you tell a few fun stories in there that just sort of illustrate both the scope of his memory or the depth of his genius. Do you have a favorite one?
Yeah, that's a tough question that I was thinking about, but it's hard to pick a favorite one. But I'm going to go with there were two occasions on which he had what I would call a Babe Ruth moment, like when Babe Ruth pointed to the stands and said, "I'm going to hit a home run over there." And for me, those would be the two times when he was facing adversity in a match, in his match against Lewis Paulson for the American Championship, and then in his match against Daniel Harwitz, the leading French master at the time. And in both instances, um, at a key point in the match, he said he mentioned to someone, a friend, that that person will never win another game from me.
Mhm.
And in both instances, that was correct. In the Paulson match, um, before Game 6, he told WJA Fuller, he said he was very frustrated with Paulson because Paulson would take an hour or more per move and, take forever on his moves.
Of course, no clocks then.
There were no clocks, and there was
Right.
supposedly a limit of a half hour a move, but it was never enforced. So Morphy, in that whole tournament, the American Chess Congress, he never took more than 12 minutes for a move. And Paulson would take an hour, 45 minutes, 35 minutes in succession. And Morphy, that flustered Morphy. It was kind of the only time in his career that he got flustered during a match. But in Game 5, Morphy ground out a technical win very beautifully in a difficult ending. And then before Game 6, he told his friend Fuller that Paulson would never win another game from him. Then he wins this incredible queen sack brilliancy, and then goes on to dominate the rest of the match. That basically broke Paulson's will. And then against Horowitz, he loses games 1 and 2. And his fans and backers are starting to get nervous because everyone has their money on Morphy. So he goes down 0-2, and then he tells his friend and companion in Europe, Frederick Edge, that won't these bettors be amused, if Harwitz never wins another game from me.
Mm-hmm.
And again, he goes out and produces, and he does it the same way he did against Paulson. He grinds him down in an end game, after a very astute choice of opening. He chooses a Dutch defense in a key game as black in a key game against Harwitz, and outplays him from a closed positional opening. And then in the next game, he wipes him off the board with another brilliancy, and then goes on to he wins 4 straight games and closes the match 5 out of 6. Well, 5.5 out of 6. Harwitz only manages one draw when Morphy blunders away a winning position and has to take a draw. But other than that, once Morphy took his opponent's measure, it was all over, basically.
Yeah, yeah. One thing that really stands out is the gap between him and everyone else that he played against, which, as like in a prior interview I did with Ben Feingold, he's a big Morphy file. And he was just highlighting the point that, like, it's amazing that Morphy reached the heights he did because no one was close to him. Like, because it's not like there was like a contemporary pushing him. He was leaps and bounds ahead of them, yet still managed to attain the strength that he did. So, um, it's just mind-boggling. And on that note, we've got 2 questions from Brian Karen, Patreon sub of Perpetual Chess, as well as the founder of the Facebook Chess Book Collectors group. Let's start with this one, which is, despite being one of the most dominant and ahead of his time players, Morphy is rarely mentioned in the greatest of all time conversations. Given his extraordinary talent and the fact he developed his skills with far less assistance than other GOAT contenders, why do you think he is often overlooked?
I think it's mostly the passage of time, because 60 or 70 years after his death, great champions like Lasker and Capablanca still, without hesitation, considered Morphy the greatest player of all time. So I think that finally, with this much time elapsed, go 100, about 175 years elapsed. Finally, his aura, started to fade. Um, and the other reason is just the briefness of his career.
Yeah.
When, like I said, 75 years later, he was so, idolized that people overrode that factor and still considered him the best. But, by this time, there have been, so many phenomenal champions, Fischer, Kasparov, and Carlsen. You know, they dominated, in a fashion almost as impressive as Morphy. But they, in the case of Kasparov and Magnus, they did it over a period of 20 years. So, it's hard to argue with their greatness and their resume. And if you had to push me to say who was the greatest player of all time at this phase, I would vote for Magnus Carlsen. But what I do say, my argument for Morphy is that I feel that he was probably the most gifted chess player who ever
Okay.
lived. I think a lot of great players, even today, would go along with that. That what he did in a period of a couple of years has never been duplicated, and that if you could transport him with all his talents to today, and if he could have a 20-year career against top flight competition, I, I think that he could have surpassed anyone who ever lived, because his genius for chess was just that phenomenal.
Yeah, one other thing on Brian's question that occurs to me is I think that people might dock Morphy in their GOAT rankings,
Right,
might maybe even subconsciously. I think
right.
just due to the lackluster quality of his competition.
Yeah,
Um,
that is the other factor. But for one thing, I think that's a little bit overblown because he played the top players in every country, and those players were very good. Anderson was an incredible tactical talent, and you can never really compare people from different eras. Know, um, so he faced very strong masters. Who maybe they were as strong as they could be given the tools of the time. Um, it, you know, chess has grown, and there are more top flight genius players today. But that's a difficult basis on which to dock somebody. you know.
yeah,
So like I said, yes, I think it's a stretch now to call him the greatest ever. But when you look at what he achieved in such a short time span, um, and also, okay, yes, you know, maybe Anderson, wasn't as strong as. Well, it's actually hard to make that argument. I'm not sure that that um, that Anderson wasn't as strong as Nepo.
right.
It's a tough comparison to make. Um, but looking just at talent, like I said, I think you can make an argument. You can
Yeah.
make that argument.
Yeah, I agree. And for the record, I agree with Brian's assessment that he's underrated and belongs in that conversation. I was just saying that I think that might be one of the reasons. It's not my personal reason.
Right, right. And another reason might be that you know the way you can make the counter argument is part of the reason he's not in the conversation is because most chess players don't realize what a universal player he was.
Yeah, that's true
How
too.
he wasn't just a great attacker; he was fantastic in every phase of the game.
Yeah,
Uh,
at a time when these ideas were still being fleshed out, you know.
right, right.
Um, And so another question I had, so as we've discussed, just obviously a historic genius, but he's often described in the book as like he studied law, and of course, coming from one of the most distinguished families in New Orleans, it seemed like there was some professional pressure for him to do something besides just play chess, and
Yes,
he sort
big
of
big time.
internalized that pressure as well. But both others and himself describe him as kind of like a mediocre lawyer,
Yeah,
even after he attained
to
the
say the
accredit.
least.
Yeah. So why do you think that someone that brilliant didn't necessarily shine in other fields?
Well, he had a genius for chess. Um, he did not have a genius for charisma, in the way that his father did. His father was, one of the leading politicians and citizens and lawyers of New Orleans, and he was a larger than life figure. Um, that wasn't Paul's genius. He was more of a shy person. He wasn't an extrovert. Um, so he just really didn't have the temperament to do what his father did. Um, he was more in the mold of his mother, who was, a brilliant musician and very cultured and had a beautiful aesthetic. He was, so I think in some ways, he was more like her. Um, but, yeah, that, talent for chess doesn't necessarily translate into talent in other areas. And that was the only, aside from the law, which wasn't a good fit for him because of the personality aspects that you have to really excel at that. Aside from that, he didn't exert himself in other fields as deeply. So he never found another niche where he could sell like that.
Okay. And just a couple more questions on Morphy for now, and then I want to talk some
Sure.
forcing chess moves, and then I want to come back to Morphy's decline. I kind of want to
Sure.
separate them because there's such a
Okay.
stark difference between this shining genius and
Yes.
the end of his life.
Right.
But while we're sticking with the high highs, of course, the opera game, probably in my opinion, the most famous chess game of all time. So I was curious, and of course, you do present the game. You tell his story linearly, with the games intertwined, and it took place obviously on this big trip to Europe. Obviously, this is in the pre-airplane age. Um, but I was curious if you discovered any sort of unknown details about this game, because I always found the whole story behind it just kind of bizarre, that it's just like an impromptu game at an opera house that became this
Uh,
legendary instructive
right.
game.
Right. Right. The short answer is no. Uh, Edward Winter has a whole piece about it in Chess Notes, and he's a go-to historian. He's amazing. The things
Yeah,
he
he is.
uncovers. I couldn't find anything new, specifically about the game. That would be a real feat because it's so famous. Um, you know, and in some ways, it, that's like a greatest hit that's been overplayed a little bit. So I like to try to emphasize, his amazing contributions that aren't as well known. And I guess my feeling is that in this day and age, everyone can Google the opera game on their computer and find a lot of stuff on it if they want to dig deeper. But I want to dig deeper more into the meat of his career. Even when I do a big piece uh, on Adolf Anderson, because one of the unique things about my Morphy book is that I really try to set the stage for, chess before Morphy,
Yeah.
so you can understand better how he transformed things. And even when I cover Anderson, I don't include his evergreen game and his immortal game, which are his two most famous games, because my feeling is, those are the ones everybody knows about, and you can easily, you know, dig deeper into those with a click of the mouse. But I want to go into the lesser known and to illuminate, the highlights of his career that are lesser known.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the upper game, for all of its genius, it's basically an exhibition game.
Right, it's an exhibition game against a relatively weak
Right.
opponent. It is a beautiful example of some tactical themes that are very important, like mates on D8, and also it's a classic example of a deflection sacrifice. So it's a good tactical ABCs game. Um, and I do put it in there. But yeah, I wouldn't emphasize it much beyond that because it's an exhibition game. And Morphy. Well, the interesting thing about that game is more the fact that he was hobnobbing with dukes and counts and
Right.
royalty, and they all wanted to get a piece of him. He was a rock star.
Yeah. Yeah. That's one thing I hadn't thought about, because obviously the dissemination of information was a lot different in the 1850s and 60s than it is now. But even in the US, when he's like, you talk about him having a good time when he was in New York, um,
Right,
uh, the degree of his fame surprised me, but considering all of the sort of raging debates about if chess is like a worthwhile pursuit,
right.
because there still was a lot of adulation for what he did.
There was tremendous adulation, everywhere he went, in Europe and in the U.S. And it's hard to even imagine today. But what I learned, in my research was that Morphy's feat was considered sort of it was a great moment for America as a country. That it was the first time an American had dominated an international field that way, and brought such fame and recognition to, to an American personality. And that was a very big deal then. He was front page on every newspaper in New York for multiple days, during his return from his European tour and during the American Chess Congress.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So one more question from Brian Karen. He writes, David Lawson's 1976 biography of Paul Morphy is widely regarded as not only the definitive work on Morphy, but also one of the greatest chess biographies ever written. He asks, in your research, did you uncover any new information or insights about Morphy, and how does your book build on or differ from Lawson's iconic work?
So yes, my book differs quite a bit from Lawson in terms of its layout and its emphasis. Um, and of course, it does draw. Any biography of Morphy has to draw a lot on Lawson. Um, what I was setting out to do was to do a chess biography, so that Morphy's life events are placed in the context. His games are all placed in the context of his life events, and so that Lawson didn't include any chess games in his book, and of course that's a big omission for chess players. It would be like reading a book on Picasso without the artwork. So what I wanted to do, I had to draw on Lawson quite a bit, but I wanted to put it all together. I wanted to write a good biography of him, um, from childhood on, his whole lifespan, and I wanted to interweave the games where they belonged. And in order to do that, I needed to have a coherent narrative. So I drew on, all the important sources. Certainly the source, the primary sources. Edge wrote about Morphy's exploits in Europe. There's his niece, Regina Morphy-Fortier, who did a little brief biographical sketch. There's Daniel Fisk, his friend, who wrote the book on the American Chess Congress. And then there's Lawson, who did a lot of deep research. So some of the things I found that Lawson missed, I went a lot deeper into Morphy's ancestry. For instance, he has two grandfathers and a great grandfather who had very fascinating stories that which I was able to unearth a lot of information about and write about. And I noticed that when people Google Morphy, a lot of times they ask about slavery and what role that played in his life. You don't really see that in Lawson, and I was able to find out some stuff about that. Um, you know, the presence of slaves in his life and the lives of his ancestors, and also the fact that one of his grandfathers turns out to have been an auctioneer who made quite a bit of money auctioning slaves. So I'm able to weave the story of Southern slavery in. I also one thing I do that Lawson doesn't do much of is I try to do a provide a historic sketch of what New Orleans was like when Morphy grew up. So I go further into that and that some of the history of that. And there are some sources that weren't available to Lawson, like Leona Carews is a very important one. She wrote a memoir. She was a neighbor of the Morphys, and she has some firsthand quotes from Morphy's father, for instance, that you won't find in Lawson. And a lot of it is just small details. There are so many details of his life, and of course I'm researching all of them. And a lot of times, Lawson helps provide the framework of life events, but then you do research online or in books and you find little details, sometimes I would go back to the source. Where possible, instead of quoting Lawson, I would try to go back to the earlier sources and see what they said and see if I could glean a little bit of new information from those older sources. Another in my opinion, a big weakness of the Lawson book is dealing with Morphy's mental illness, because Lawson was by no means, a mental health expert, and didn't claim to be. And with my background as a psychotherapist for 15 years, I found a lot of Lawson's views about Morphy's decline in mental health to be sort of off the cuff and not educated or modern understandings of Morphy's illness. So that's one area where I think I differed. But just the whole structure of my book, it's a very different project than Lawson. The fact that I'm trying to do the broad sweep of Morphy's biography, Morphy's chess games, and Morphy's contributions to chess thought and his legacy. And that's another area that Lawson doesn't really go into because it's beyond the scope of his book.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't read Lawson's book, so I can't speak to it, but I definitely enjoyed this, and we'll return to the topic of Morphy's mental health issues in the later years. But I want to do a chess improvement interlude because, as I've mentioned, such a big fan of forcing chess moves that even before even prior to this book, I long wanted to interview you about that. So my first question, and for listeners who haven't heard me talk about this book before, it's a great tactics primer for, I would say, 1600 to 2000, something like that is probably the primary audience. But it was, in my opinion, ahead of its time in terms of advancing how we look at tactics, particularly. You write that traditional tactics books neglected the question, how can I find tactics more consistently in my game? So it's more meta than a lot of tactics books. What led you to that realization, Charles?
Let me go a little sideways again to answer that. So I started, doing research on forcing moves and, compiling positions. And, I wanted to do something a little different than traditional tactics books because, tactics books that the first thing that you need to learn are, what I would call the geometric motifs, pins, forks, skewers, and then you can go beyond those motifs a little. You can expand to things like overworked pieces, removing the defender, and these are things that I deal with in my kids' books, Power Chess for Kids 1 and 2. So some even adults have used those as those would be a good prerequisite to forcing chess moves. So you need a good understanding. You need a good foundation in those as your first step toward tactical mastery. You have to understand sort of the geometry of chess tactics. But then beyond I was going a step beyond that and trying to say, what makes it hard for us to find winning moves? And as I started doing this research and compiling all these tactical positions, I started to find categories of forcing moves that are difficult, for humans to find or for my students to find. One example would be, in a given position, the strongest attacking move might be a retreat that at first sight looks like a passive move. There are even some examples, knight for rook 1, exclam, the strongest attacking move on the board. And those moves are just naturally harder for humans to find because they don't look like attacking moves, because we have a sort of a bias in our head about what an attacking move is. So I started to categorize these unusual tactics that that trip us up because they're less intuitive. And then as I started to do that, it started to occur to me that, one of the big advantages of computers, aside from the fact that they can calculate, gazillion moves ahead and that they have perfect board sight, another big advantage they have is no human bias. To them, that knight to rook one exclam is just another ply.
Right.
So I started realizing that, that's how I developed this concept of computer eyes. That if you could look at the position with the eyes of a computer, it might open you up to some possibilities that you would normally discount because you would say, that doesn't look like an attacking move, or that doesn't look like a positional move. Well, sometimes you have to calculate the forcing moves first and then decide, whether they, it's not as important what they look like, it's what they do and what they threaten. And, since a forcing move limits the opponent's options, which means that they make a threat to win material or mate, that move knight to rook one, it might make a threat that limits the opponent's options to only one or two, replies because it's making a very important threat. And one of the advantages of forcing moves, and the reason why any strong master looks at forcing moves first, is because they're easier to analyze because of the fact the opponent has limited responses. Therefore, you can analyze them pretty thoroughly, and if they work, then you don't have to. Your analysis may be over. You don't have to look any further. If they don't work, then you say, okay, well, if I don't have a forcing move that's effective here, then what else can? But it should be a habit of all players to make. It's like dotting your I's, crossing your T's, to look at the forcing moves first before you go on to other options.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm a fan of the term computerized that you coined, by the way. I think it's quite evocative and helpful. And on the topic of sort of scanning forcing moves, we had another listener question. This one is from Adam Bryant, who writes, he says, it's often said that people's tactical prowess can be excellent when looking for their own moves, but the same player is much worse at spotting their opponent's resources. Um, so he wonders, so for example, a puzzle might say white to play. Do you think it's a good idea to always start by looking at the opponent's potential tactics first to develop that habit, or is that too inefficient?
Well, I think that's a hard thing to do when you know the purpose of the problem. You know it's a white to play and win.
Right.
But it's a very important point that you raise about the need to look at your opponent's plans too. Uh, and I wrote something called the Hertan hierarchy, which it was originally published in the Chess Instructor, which was a compendium published by Newman Chess, and then it was reprinted in the current edition of Forcing Chess Moves at the end. And it's a guideline about the thinking process for a club player. It's really an improvement tool. So it's sort of a checklist of, okay, the opponent makes a move. What do I think about first? So in that Hertan hierarchy, the first thing I say is, opponent makes a move. What's his threat? That's the
Right.
first. When he makes a move, is he threatening? Maybe his move is a forcing move that's limiting my options by making a concrete threat to mate or win material. So it is any master is going to think about that first. The whole goal here is kind of to teach a club player to think like a master, to have a master level thinking process. Not that you're going to see the same things, but at least you're going to prioritize the right things. Because any master, when you make a move, the first thing they say is, "What's the threat?" Okay, and I delve into that pretty deeply in this Hertan hierarchy. So one thing I say is, one if your answer is yes, he did make a threat, my first question is the threat real? So can you calculate out his threat and then try to look one move deeper and see if there's a stinger at the end of the line that turns things around. So yeah, I do think it's important to have that focus, but I don't know if problem solving is the way. And I wouldn't worry about that because you want to be solving tons of, win in one or two moves, mate in one or two moves problems, primarily to absorb your ABCs and to develop your board sight. Because that's what the Soviet school did. The first 2 years were dedicated to basic endings and to tactical patterns. So you just want to expose yourself and look at a ton of winning ideas, winning tactical ideas, um, and absorb those because that's part of your tactical training. Very important part. And then calculation is another thing that goes along with it. There are several skills involved in being a good calculator and in analyzing forcing moves. Um, the first is that pattern recognition. The second is brute force calculation. And the third is evaluation, also to be able to evaluate at the end of the line, who stands better. That's a big one. That even goes beyond sort of the scope of forcing chess moves, but it's all in there. And you need to be working on all those aspects of calculation.
Yeah, well said. Good advice. And then just one more thing on forcing moves. Igor Feinstein had written in a question asking how this book is different from other tactics books, and I can actually answer that one myself, which is just there's a lot more exposition of like how the brain works and um, what it is that might help you spot the tactic. So it's not just like solve the puzzle, here's the answer. There's a lot more prose. I mean, my favorite tactics book for intermediate level players is Chess Tactics from Scratch, and I think that that's a good book to do before yours. But I think those two together for the again say 1500 to 2000 level, something like that, are a great way to dig deep into tactics. But before we get back to Morphy, Charles, I just wanted to hear a little bit about your own chess. Because first of all, I knew you were an FM, but I didn't realize you were like peak USCF rating of 2500 until I stalked your USCF page. You were quite. You mentioned being an average master, but quite a bit stronger than an average master. But your last tournament was in 1999, around the age of 39 or 40, according to my internet detecting. So what led you to stop playing OTB?
Right. Well, yeah, that's a good question. I thought I would play forever for a while, and I was getting better into my late 30s. That is when I peaked at around 2515 USCF and 2410 FIDE. Um, well, but it was other life things going on. Two marriages, a career in human services. Around that time, I moved out to where I live now in Western Massachusetts, and it's a great area for me in a lot of ways, but it's a wasteland for chess.
Okay.
So in order to play, I would have to travel, anywhere I went. There's nothing around. As far as I can determine, I'm the strongest player who ever lived in this area.
Right.
Except, well, Patrick Wolf lived here when he was 12 years old. But other
Right.
than that, there's no competition. And the other aspect of it was when I got away from it a little bit and wasn't studying as hard, I quickly realized that at my level, you need to be studying 15 or 20 hours a week just to tread water, just to keep your strength. And you need to be playing in, ideally a tournament a month or at least every 5 or 6 weeks. It's a lot of work and it's rather grueling to compete at that high a level. And it just became too much of an obstacle for me, with, more recently having kids, working full-time jobs always. And once I got out of practice, it's very hard to get back to where you were.
Yeah.
It will take a year or two. Um, and also, I kind of lost my taste for the competitive aspect. I mean, I loved it when I was younger. It's very exciting, but it's also very intense and grueling. It's the sporting aspect um, is is hard, and I wouldn't preclude ever having to come back. But what I found was I enjoyed the writing so much that it gave me a way to stay really connected to chess. And in my 40s, I realized that my talent for writing was probably as good, if not even better, than my chess talent. So I sort of found a niche for myself. And at this stage, it's hard to get back in.
Yeah, once you're out, I'm 47 and was
Right.
playing a lot, but I haven't played for 6 months, and I can definitely feel like every day that you're not back in it, it gets harder. I've compared it many
Yep.
times to
Right. Right.
an exercise regimen.
Yeah, and the opportunity is important. When I was in my early 20s, in some ways it was the peak of my career when I became a strong player. And I was playing in international tournaments in New York all the time because I was living right outside New York. So I was getting phenomenal experience. And I made three norms in the space of 3 years, but one of them only had 8 games. So, on a technicality, I'm talking about IM norms.
Right.
Um, and also at that time, there was a rule that one of your norms had to be in a round robin tournament, which was very difficult for a young player at that time. I wasn't one of the top guys who was getting all the invitations and stuff. So, I sort of regret that I didn't go whole hog when I was younger to get the title, because I certainly feel that I'm IM strength. I mean, the true measure of strength is your rating. And an official IM rating is 2,400 FIDE. That's what you have to achieve in order to get the title. And if you include Swiss systems, I was performing at an IM level for years and years.
Yeah. Yeah.
There
Like I
were a
said,
couple of Swisses when I went undefeated and got basically made a GM norm, but in America those don't count. If you're in Europe, all the tournaments just about have norms, and
right.
you're playing enough foreigners, enough title players. So it was partly circumstantial. I did. An American has to go out of their way a little bit.
Yeah, it's better than it used to be now with New York and Charlotte both and St. Louis running some norm
Right.
tournaments. But yeah, I think that's why I was surprised by your rating is because you were an FM, not an IM. But
Uh-huh.
obviously, I certainly understand the getting the norms themselves. We've talked like when I've interviewed people like Feingold and why he didn't make GM for a long time. Like
Right.
you really had to go out of your way to try to do
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, well, let's return oh, actually, one more question on this because I am intrigued by the point you made about you were continuing to improve until you quit. Was it at a 39?
Um, right. Yeah.
So were you doing anything special to continue to ascend? Because I think a lot of people feel like they start to have peak earlier. I mean, peak earlier in years.
I did work on my repertoire a little more in a more focused way. I had a notebook, back it was pre-computer,
Right.
so I had a notebook, and I was trying to get a little more serious about that. And I've actually been looking at my old games recently, and my big challenge was to learn to be more aggressive. I started out very afraid of losing when I was a kid, and even as I got better, probably the stuff I wrote about enforcing chess moves is the stuff that I needed more of when I was a kid coming up. And so it took me a long time to, you know, to become a more balanced player. I mean, my strength was always in positional play and endings, but I could be, I needed to be a better tactician. I was a good tactician, but I needed to be better, and I needed to miss less forcing moves and, be more balanced. And toward in the late 90s, I started to put it together more and, have some really strong results. And that's what propelled me over 2,500.
Okay. Yeah, I wouldn't have guessed that as your weakness from having read Forcing Chess Moves because some of those puzzles are pretty tough. Um, so returning to Morphy, so to set the stage for listeners, he had this incredible ascension, tours through Europe and just crushes everyone who plays him, feted everywhere he goes, and then comes back to the United States. But it all unravels quickly. I mean, it's not long, at least. I mean, both I think as you think about the timeline and just in the chronology of the book,
Right,
before by your description, he's kind of living alone in New Orleans and not having a lot of social contact and spotted wandering the streets, muttering to himself and
right.
no longer
Living with
playing
family,
living
actually,
with
but yeah,
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 right, sorry, and no longer playing chess. So one thing I was curious about Charles is because I've been lucky enough to interview people. Obviously, as you write, he's often compared to Fischer because they're the two greatest talents in American history, and both of
right,
them suffered from mental health issues. But with Fischer, I've been lucky enough to interview people like James Sherwin, Andy Soltis, Asa Hoffman, who were able to give like firsthand accounts of what Fischer's mental state was like before it was obviously bad. But
right,
with Morphy, I didn't like not if I didn't know the story, I wouldn't see it coming. So
right.
one thing
That's
I'm
right.
curious about is were there any signs of this prior to other than the trauma you write about? Were there mental signs prior to his decline?
Well, it was very gradual, but I well, I think it did. I think it did start in early adulthood, um, but it became severe over time. And I guess the early signs are just like you said, sort of the failure to launch, the
Hmm.
fact that he tried to have a quote unquote respectable job as a lawyer. He couldn't do it. He never left the family home. He never had any intimate relationships that we know of. Um, so, but like you said, there were traumatic events leading up to this, very traumatic. He lost his father at an early age. His uncle, who was his mentor, moved 800 miles away when distance was very important in those days. And then the Civil War,
Right.
New Orleans was occupied. His family had to abandon their house and move to France. So he went through a lot, but that doesn't necessarily lead to mental illness for people. And so that I would say there were the early signs that he wasn't making the successful transition into adulthood. There were also, just weird things like, the fact that he would turn down obvious ways to make some money and do something useful. Like there was one point after the Civil War where he was trying to get a contract to write a book of his games, which obviously would have been tremendous. And the publisher said, you know, the economy's down now. We'll do it if you just go play a few new games and have some new material. And he refused to do that. Which he was doing nothing in his life. He could have had this project that could have helped his family out and given him a little bit of self-esteem, but he just became so averse to chess that I think that was intertwined with the early phases of his illness. Um, and there are mental illnesses that tend to start in early adulthood, and and can become very serious. Even schizophrenia occasionally starts sometime in early 20s. So I don't think he was, you know, profoundly ill in his early 20s. I think it was a slide that happened, but I think that there was a biochemical imbalance, which was, you know, genetically based, and that combined that with his kind of loss of identity as he stopped playing chess. But then he becomes increasingly paranoid, and then by his 30s, he's already having um, a lot of bizarre paranoid delusions and things. So um, he had, in my opinion, Um, his mental illness was more biologically based. There had to be a genetic component, and then it got worse and worse. And it could be that the evidence points there's a strong likelihood that he organically deteriorated. So later in life, he had some kind of organic brain
Right.
syndrome where he really went nuts. Now, Fischer never had that. What Fischer's mental health profile, it fits better with um, someone who had a traumatic childhood. You know, his father, Fischer's father, was totally absent. His mother was poor. Um, he was very isolated. He didn't get along with his peers. So Fischer used chess as a lifeline. He found that he was brilliant at that one thing, and that was the one thing that got him through. And so Fischer later develops a mental illness that's not as profound as Morphy's. He's still able to function. He's able to make a living. He's able to live independently. He's just, goes off. He goes off the deep end a little bit when he's triggered by, certain events or people, and he has some paranoid thoughts. But he didn't have that profound organic illness that Morphy developed later, where he would be mumbling incoherently in the street to non-existent imaginary people, and thinking that barbers had a conspiracy to kill him. I mean,
Yeah.
Morphy's illness was much more profound than Fischer's.
Yeah, sad in both cases though. And with Morphy, so you mentioned you think it was probably genetically driven. Did you find any similar stories about relatives of Morphy?
No, I didn't. And that would be interesting genetically. If you could follow it forward and see if there's some issues in current ancestors. But well, I mean, his sister Helene, his oldest sister, I mean, youngest sister, she also never launched from the family home.
Hmm.
So there could be something there. Um, and in terms of organic brain injury, it's possible that there was an organic component to his father's death because his father had a tragic accident and then he was dead within a month or two. And at the time, they called it congestion of the brain, but that's a non-diagnosis today. That was the quack medicine of the time. So usually that diagnosis indicated a stroke back then. But if he had something like a brain tumor, that could also explain it. So there's no obvious family history of illness, but the illness he had today, we know that that comes from a biochemical imbalance, and that there's almost always a genetic element to that.
And you wrote that along with some sort of like organic brain issue, the other primary possibility would be what we would call now paranoid schizophrenia.
Well, that is a possibility because he was having psychotic symptoms.
Hmm.
He was, he had, psychotic delusions that his brother-in-law was, withholding his inheritance, and he had bizarre symptoms. So um, those could be consistent with schizophrenia, but I'm not sure about that. In other ways, um, he would be a little bit atypical for a schizophrenic. Like his social skills were still pretty good when if he wasn't agitated, up until the end where he became very profoundly ill. He could carry on a good conversation. He could be decent company.
Right. Like you
You
tell the story of him meeting Steinitz
know,
and in
yeah,
New Orleans. Yeah. And he put on a good
right,
showing. Like,
right. So a lot of times a schizophrenic will have a more awkward social presentation. So I'm not really inclined to go there, but it's one of the possible diagnoses for someone who has profound psychotic symptoms. And psychotic means a real break with reality. Like you can't differentiate fantasy from reality. And he definitely had those symptoms. So that's
Yeah.
my possible diagnosis. But that's why I tend to gravitate more towards some kind of organic illness like a dementia or something like that, especially
Okay.
for this later profound mental health.
And in your interview with Dirk Janten Guzendum with New in Chess, you talked about this a little bit, but just to sort of set the record for listeners. Um, so obviously, the two greatest American talents both had mental health issues, but you don't think you're not blaming chess for that, to be clear.
No, no, I mean, the fact that they're both Americans is a coincidence. I mean, Magnus seems like a very well-rounded guy. Kasparov was a very well-rounded guy. That there's examples throughout chess history, Lasker, Capablanca, of plenty of healthy, well-rounded people who are chess geniuses. But is there a correlation between genius and illness? Probably, maybe. That you could say the same thing about artists, musicians,
Right.
people who are very creative. Um, that there are certain mental health diagnoses like bipolar disorder. A lot of times there are a lot of very bright people with disorder. So there could be some loose correlation, but I wouldn't overblow it.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair. And one last question about Morphy. So you wrote in his time in Paris, part of the reason he performed poorly at the beginning of the matches is like maybe he was spending some late nights out in Paris. But as you mentioned, other than that, there's no record of like romantic relationships in his life. Certainly, we know he was isolated at the end of his life. So I am curious, like what, and he's described as not like fairly short and not particularly outgoing. But what was
Right.
his social life like in his good years?
I think it was all around chess.
Hmm.
All his positive, well, social life that we know of. Of course, we're studying him from the perspective of his career, but people loved him in the chess world. They gravitated to him everywhere he went. That's something that's surprising about Morphy is his aura, his personality. When you read the introduction to my book, people had glowing praise for him as a human being, because he was so modest and unassuming and approachable. He would talk to anyone. He would play anyone who came up and wanted to talk or play a game in Paris. Um, and that humbleness and his sheer genius really blew people away. In Paris he was beloved. I mentioned that he was probably the most popular American in France since Benjamin Franklin,
Right.
celebrity when he was there a long time before Morphy. So I think he had a built-in social life when he was an active chess player. You know, um, Everyone wanted to be around him. But when he was on his own at home, I don't think he. I think he became like a neighborhood fixture, like everyone. I mean, he
Right.
walked around the neighborhood every day. His routine was he would go read the paper, he would go to the opera, he would, you know, apparently he was very conscientious of his appearance, and he would sometimes change his clothes multiple times a day and look very dapper. So, and he became sort of a likable crazy guy in his neighborhood in New Orleans. So, but there is no indication that he had close friends except for Maury and friends that he made in childhood and his family friends. But at that stage, he had a good social life when he was in school and in college. This was before the mental illness started to creep in, and he was well liked and he had friends. But the more mental illness crept in, the more I think he just and then when he dropped his chess community, relationship sort of fell off the map, and his family stuck by him. Luckily for him, the whole way. That's about it.
Yep, that is about it. Well, there's plenty more in the book. Again, it's fantastic. Highly recommend it. The Real Paul Morphy, get it on all the places we discussed. Again, I still think it's great for an e-reader personally. I think my last question for you, Charles, is do you have a favorite game after this deep dive on all of Morphy's games? A favorite game of his?
Uh-huh. Yeah, I thought about that question, and it's a tough one. It's tough for me to pick favorites. So a few things. I would have to go with a few things instead of one, because different games highlight such different parts of his brilliance. So some of the games were just particularly interesting to analyze and to look at, and just as examples of really fascinating chess struggles. And one was game nine against in the Lowenthal match, where he plays this positional line that was new, and he gets a, a closed position where he comes under a very strong queenside attack. And then it's just a fascinating game with twists and turns. Then it ends in this incredible ending where Morphy makes a comeback and finally wins beautifully in this ending. So, and that was like a battle royale. That was it was sort of Lowenthal's last stand. And then I could also go with the time. There were three times I could identify where I call it Morphy's 1-2 punch, where he was in a key match position, and first he played a phenomenal ending, and you'll see in my book that what probably the most underrated aspect of Morphy's play is his endgame play.
Hmm.
Uh, was an absolute genius in the ending, and as far as we know from what's extant, he took endings to a way way higher pinnacle than it had ever been before. So that's a great aspect of his game that holds up to computer scrutiny even today. So you can see that in game three against Lowenthal, where he has struggled during the first couple of games, and Lowenthal missed a win in game two, and then Lowenthal says that in game three he realized just how strong Morphy was, and that he got him in a stranglehold and wouldn't let go. So you would think that it was a brilliant attack or a brilliant strategic game, but it was actually a game where Lowenthal was better in an ending, and Morphy just held on, fantastically, and then turned the tables and won a very very deep rook ending. And so he grinds down Lowenthal that way in game three. Then in game four, he just wipes him off the board with brilliancy. And the same thing happened with Lewis Paulson in that match. There, he struggled early in the match. Then in game five, he grinds Paulson down in a very, very difficult ending where he starts out a little inferior. And then he plays his incredible queen sack game in game six, which might be probably Morphy's greatest tactical achievement. And then also in the Harwich match, the same thing in game three. Um, After Harwich has won the first two games, Morphy plays a positional Dutch defense. He just outplays Harwich, gets a better ending, and then is able to, Harwich misses his chances to hold, and Morphy gets on the board. And then again, he comes back and wins a beautiful brilliancy in game four. So I would go with those. And, if you want to look at the surprising, positional strength of Morphy, one game I would point out is a game he played in a simultaneous in London against eight opponents, and he played a master named Catley. And there's a game he plays that's so positionally clean that you could imagine it was played 10 years ago easily. And, he just, he positionally crushes the guy and then ends with a combination. So,
a lot of choices.
Yeah, yeah. I can't pick one.
Okay, well, I will link to those, but of course, listeners should pick up the book, and yeah, can't recommend it highly enough. And thank you, Charles. Any closing words as we wrap up?
Um, no, but I guess just thank you to all the people out there who appreciate my books. I love writing, I love teaching, and you can contact me via New in Chess or on Facebook. I'm there and I'm putting out updates on the Morphy book. And there is a 5-star review coming out in New in Chess magazine by Sadler. So I really look forward to it. I haven't seen it yet, but I look forward to
Yeah,
it.
well deserved. All right, well, I will link to that as well, and once it appears. And thanks so much, Charles.
Thank you.